In this episode of the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast, I am coming to you live from New York City. So if you hear the background noise of trains, sirens, people arguing, or whatever, it is because I am right here in the heart of Brooklyn. But in this episode, we're going to talk about the Elite Eight. We're going to talk about some players who elevated their draft stock in the minds of Leif Thulin in the Elite Eight. Big shout out to each and every person that has made the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast your first listen of the day. I'm your host, Rafael Barlowe, along with my co-host, the man that watches more basketball than anyone I know, anyone in the world probably, Leif Thulin. And this episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code Locked On NBA for $20 off your first purchase. And if you are not subscribed to the YouTube channel, please subscribe, like, share, comment, click the bell so you can be notified every time we drop an episode. And your favorite NBA team has a newsletter on the Locked On Network. So check it out at lockedondaily.com. Again, lockedondaily.com. It is your one stop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. So subscribe to Locked On NBA Big Boy YouTube channel and Locked On Daily for your newsletter. All right, let's get this episode started. Like I said, I'm in New York City. I apologize for the background noise. I'm looking out the window of my hotel, and I am for real in the heart of Brooklyn. A train is going to come by any minute. You're going to hear sirens. You might hear people arguing. You might hear construction going on, but this is the real New York City experience. I am here along with James. James is downstairs working, but we are here for the McDonald's All-American game, and we attended a practice yesterday that was deep with NBA high-level scouts and GMs and so on. And the players that they were there to see, hopefully we will get a chance to see them next year in the Elite Eight in the Final Four. But we are going to talk about the 2025 NBA draft prospects that played in the Elite Eight over the weekend. All right, before we get started in the names, just tell me about the games. You had all the number one seeds made it. You said you were going chalk. You didn't feel good about going chalk. And how's your bracket?
Yeah, taking chalk's not always the most fun, but I really did feel this year that 4 teams were better than the rest for much of the season, and they happened to be the 1 seed, so I trusted my gut, and thus the brackets that I've made are both doing well. I'm in a group with about 35 people, and right now I'm in first place, so hopefully that one works. And the other one, I'm in 6th place, but I'm the only person with the team I have winning it in that one. So I'm hopeful that that I can win it or win both of those, if that's not actually possible. But it's always the best regardless. I'm watching tons of ball. It's like I'm a kid on Christmas all over again and watching basketball all week. And because we've had chalk, it means that there's been less quote-unquote madness, but there's been more exciting games late in the tournament than we've had in previous seasons. So I love it. And my favorite team to watch this season has been Florida. And my favorite player to watch this season, and it's a guy I've been banging the drum for, saying he's a first-round pick for months. And so everyone talking about Stan Van Gundy saying Thomas Haugh's making a ton of money is late to the party, and I can't wait to talk about him with you here.
All right, so we'll talk about Hauch in 1 second. I want to talk about like the number one seeds. You know, I've seen the people say that the transfer portal and NIL has ruined March Madness because you don't have as many Cinderella stories or you know, just the upsets. I feel like, yes, you can say that. I don't think that's going to be consistent going forward. I don't think you're going to always have number one seeds. I do think there are going to be some mid-major upsets. This was just a perfect storm in the sense. But despite like no real like Cinderella stories, we've had some really good games. We've had a Derek Queen buzzer beater. We've seen Walter Clayton hit some big shots. We've seen comebacks. I mean, we've seen some really good games, and it has been chaotic like it would expect the NCAA tournament to be. But let's switch to Thomas Haugh. You're right. You've been talking about Haugh online, offline, saying he's a first-round pick for at least 6 weeks, in my opinion. Why are we late to the Thomas Haugh party, and what makes him a first-round pick?
Yeah, Thomas Haugh is a guy just for background, that I watched last year and thought, man, I think next year he should play more because they played hand-locked him before he got hurt, and Condon and Haugh were off the bench. And I thought, man, I almost think they're better with them. They're just not as physically strong. They were both freshmen. And I thought to myself, when they play, though, the skill level raises. So I kind of had a mental note all the way back to March of last year when they lost to Colorado in the first round. And then when I watched Florida at the start this year, I watched more Florida than probably anyone that's not a Gators fan, because one of my coworkers is a Florida fan, and we would talk about Florida basketball all the time. And I kept telling him, man, my favorite player on your team is Thomas Haugh. Like every time I'd watch and we'd discuss what we were thinking, I would tell him, I think the best pro on your team is Thomas Haugh. And that was knowing Walter Clayton was likely going to be an All-American. Early in the season, it became pretty obvious in that regard. So I didn't start tweeting about this until January or February, but I've been talking to my friend and coworker probably since November about thinking that he's their best pro, just because Walter Clayton's archetype is a small shooting oriented point guard, and he's new to playing the point guard. And I think he's done better than I thought he would, but Hauck's got all the tools to give that full circle. The reason that I think everyone has missed out on it is it doesn't shine in box scores. Not everyone has the time to watch all these games and completion, and maybe there's synergy cues and say, you know what, we're going to watch his pick and roll. Like there's not many of those. He doesn't do that many pick and pops. So there's nothing that's one skill that differentiates that makes everyone pique their interest. He's so well-rounded. What he does well is everything. He rebounds very well. He slides his feet very well, gets every loose ball. He shoots over 80% from the line. He's becoming a better and better shooter, and he's at 35+% from three as a power forward who's athletic enough to guard 1 through 5 defensively, gets out in transition, runs the floor, sets great screens, makes incredible passes, and has no issue playing without the ball and scoring 4 points in a game if it helps his team win. And then in the biggest moment of the season when they need it most, he hits 2 big threes, get the loose ball offensive rebound, and knocks down a 3 of the later in the possession to score 20 points against a team, Texas Tech, that frankly had the physical size on Florida, because Florida usually plays 2 bigs, and it's Chinyelu and Condon, but they played Haugh for the vast majority of the game because he's their best player. He's their best winner. So what people are missing is how great a mundane looking performance in a stat line can look if the player is executing is playing winning basketball.
So you kind of answered my next question, but I'll propose it anyway. Let's say I'm I'm not a casual NBA draft guy, but I follow all the draft boards and I don't see his name on there. I listen to this podcast and I say, well, okay, the numbers are, modest, rounded up, 10 points, 6 rebounds, 2 assists, 48% from the floor. And then I look in the NCAA tournament. He moves it up to 13.3 points, 7.5 rebounds, 3 assists, a block, a steal, but on 42, 29, 80 shooting splits. That doesn't necessarily scream first round for a sophomore. But why is he a first rounder?
Well, I would argue the numbers going up are interesting because it's not like he put up big numbers in the early rounds. Like when they played in their 16 game, he didn't put up big numbers. So when he's putting up his biggest numbers are when they need him most. And when it becomes winning time, his minutes go up because the coach realizes, well, our winning player is Thomas Haugh. You put him on the floor, you're going to get loose balls. The biggest moments in Florida's season have been against UConn at the end of the game, and who got both of their offensive rebounds that were batted out? Thomas Haugh dove on the ball and got both of those. When they needed him most against Texas Tech, he guarded Darion Williams better than Condon did, who was getting pushed around by Darion Williams, who's another guy I really like and thought he had a great performance in the tournament. And Thomas Haugh guarded him and also scored 20 points, many of which were in the desperation moments when they trailed by as many as 10 in the final 6 minutes of the basketball game. And they won the basketball game because of Walter Clayton's big shots. I fully understand those are going to take the shine, but Walter Clayton's shots wouldn't have mattered had Thomas Haugh not gotten 2 offensive rebounds and hit 2 threes to put them within striking distance.
How high can he go?
I'd consider taking him at number 20. I don't think he's got the upside that a guy like Carter Bryant, for instance, another guy that I've talked about for a long time, really liking. I would take as high as 14. I don't think he has the upside because Carter Bryant's toolsier. He's longer. He's more run and jump athletic. His shot is probably more fluid at this point, though the numbers are pretty comparable. I think Carter Bryant's got a more upside to be that 3-and-D wing stopper than Thomas Haugh. Thomas Haugh's the guy you put in, and you know you're going to get a solid basketball player, a glue guy, a rotational piece, and teams that are drafting around 20 to 30, they're winning franchises for the most part. You draft a guy who expects to win, has played in the Final Four, and knows how to play winning basketball. Those are the guys that make the team, as opposed to the projects that you see buried on the bench or were stashed in the G League and you hope eventually turn out. Like if you look at the last 4 drafts, how many of those winning teams have drafted a player and then seen those players play for them in the first couple of years? It's not a very large amount. It's almost staggering how few take it as in, hey, let's take a winning piece and prolong our success right now, especially when we have to pay all these guys that are truly the engines for the success. I think more teams are going to take solid pieces, and Thomas Haugh screams to me a guy who can play in the NBA because he does everything well. There's a world in which Florida says, hey, we're going to pay you a ton to come back and you're going to be featured, and I think that's possible, but I really wanted to, and if you guys listen to this, the everydayers probably know, when we did our first bracket reaction, I talked about, hey, I could do a full podcast on Thomas Haugh because he's going to be a first-round pick. So this is not the hindsight thing, but I'm really happy that people are coming around, and Stan Van Gundy made the case like the best NBA player out here is Thomas Haugh. Like he's making so much money because he makes all the right plays. I think it really takes a lot of watching him, film watching, and watching the entire game as opposed to watching just catch and shoot, just something, to know how well-rounded he is and what a positive impact he makes on the game as compared to the already very good teammates he has that can either play in front of him or behind him. And he's the best prospect on a team that could win a national title, and that rarely doesn't translate to being a number 1 pick.
There's nothing like watching basketball live. The energy of the crowd, the sound of the sneakers on the hardwood, and maybe even a celebrity sighting courtside. And if you want to catch a game in person, Game Time makes getting tickets easier than ever. With Game Time's new feature, Game Time Picks, it filters out the fluff and shows you only the best deals on great seats, so you do not have to waste time scrolling through thousands upon thousands of tickets. I am in New York City. I didn't get a credential to the McDonald's game, so I'm going to end up buying tickets on the Game Time app. One, because I will be able to see exactly my view before I buy. There's no surprise fees, and it has a lowest price guarantee, so I can book with total confidence. So you also can take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Game Time, my favorite app when it comes to buying tickets. All right, let's switch over to Duke and Kon Knueppel. Kon is a player, I just wrote about it today on NBABigBoard.com. Kon is a player that I was high on coming into the season, and then I felt like he had some games in the non-conference schedule where he struggled. I think there was a game where he just barely even got off shots, and I thought like some of his flaws were magnified in the early non-conference games. So then you go to the ACC, and we can admit that the ACC wasn't really strong this year. And he played extremely well for a freshman, and so on. Cooper Flag goes down. Knueppel leads the charge, or him and Tyrese Proctor lead the charge. Duke wins the ACC tournament. There are still some people that felt like that is a sign of how weak the ACC is, that a team can lose their best player, even though Duke has multiple guys on draft boards. But how many teams can lose their best player, the number 1 pick, and still win the conference? Was that a sign of how good Duke is, or was that a sign of how bad the ACC is? Fast forward.
In my opinion. Like, I think the ACC was horrible. The worst it's ever been. And Duke obviously has great players, but I don't even think that Louisville team that they played in the championship was all that great. I mean, they lost in the first round of the tournament. Like, no team in the ACC made it out of the second round other than Duke. So I think the ACC was terrible, but Duke's special. I mean, the reason Kon Knueppel has impressed me, and it's funny, we talked way back in July about who's going to start and why, And I said, when there's smoke, there's a fire. Kon Knueppel, I keep hearing that he could be the leading scorer on this team, and therefore he's probably going to start. And then I started watching him, and you referenced a couple games, like the non-conference game you referenced. There was Auburn, in which he didn't get any shots off. He was hounded, and they top locked him, and he couldn't find a way to get to the hoop. And my main criticism is, yeah, he plays off 2 feet, and he's really good at it, but it's because he's not athletic enough to take an advantage, and he has to use kind of strength to push his way past smaller guards. And when he plays bigger opponents, it won't happen. And I think I was too critical. I think I was wrong. Kon Knueppel's individual creation's far better than I gave it credit. I do think he gets a little bit of an advantage created by Duke's system. They set good screens. They get advantages because he's not guarded by the best player. It's usually Cooper Flagg. They have a 7'2" rolling center, and they have plenty of spacing around. Like, not everyone has that luxury, but he takes advantage of it to such a degree. He gets the paint, can finish with either hand. He can kick out, and his vision and creativity is far better than I gave it credit for. And I'm seeing it against good teams. Yes, Duke's been dominant, but they beat Alabama, who's probably the 6th best team in the country, and they beat them by 20. And you saw that creativity against a team with a surplus of athletes, and you saw him knock down shots. I never had a question about it. Can't make shots. Like, if he makes shots, Duke wins games. But it was never about his shooting. That was always a given. It was about what more can he do to make him warrant a top 10 pick, when I'm a believer in upside. I've always been a believer in upside when you're drafting high, but I think there's more upside than I gave him credit for. But I do still think he's more of a safety pick than, shooting for the moon. Are you drafting Derek Queen or Kon Knueppel? Like, if you're drafting around 7, I'd probably lean Derek Queen because I think he's got more chance to be a star. But that's not a slight at Kon Knueppel, because I think he's going to be a steady, productive starter for years to come in the NBA. And I think I was late to the party and overly critical from what I saw in the early games because the ACC was so weak. I didn't give the credit to his growth that I probably should have.
Yeah, I feel like he's turned the corner. He's closing strong, which is all you can ask for in a sense. You want a guy to finish on a strong note. He had 21 points, got to the line 7 times against Alabama, and prior to that, the Arizona game, he had 20 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists. He was 5 of 7 from the floor, 2 of 2 from deep, but also got to the foul line 9 times. So he's just really stuffing the stat sheet and contributing and scoring, rebounds, passing, getting fouled. He's tough. There are a lot of times where he's the toughest player on the floor. If he's not the toughest player on the floor, he's the second toughest player on the floor behind Cooper Flagg. He's competitive, and I think he's really helped himself. He's answered the questions that I had. At one point, the shooting, it wasn't bad, but he didn't have the efficiency you would expect for a guy whose main calling card is going to be shooting. But the way he's been shooting the ball lately, and I mean, those questions have been answered. He ended up shooting 40% from 3, which is about what I expected coming into the season. There was at one point where he was hovering around like 35%, but he finished at, well, I shouldn't say he finished. As of today, right now, going into the Final Four, he's at 40% from 3, 91% from the foul line, and like 48% from the floor. So I think he's really helped himself with his performance. Again, the toughness, the passing. He has really good chemistry with Khaman Maluach, who we're going to talk about next. I think that Knueppel has one. I think he's a lock for the lottery, but I think you can make a strong case and say that he's solidified himself as a top 10 pick.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's unlikely he falls out of the top 10. Like, you'd have to have some real prospect swings you take for Noah Senge or someone like that in order for him to fall out of it.
Yep, I think he's the epitome of safe. Yeah. Even though there are some scouts, and I mean, there's a ton of scouts and ton of NBA guys that are here in New York for the McDonald's game. And then some were here just because Duke played in Newark. And so it's, just right across the water in a sense. There are some that have concerns about like the athleticism and the length. He doesn't have the physical tools that teams normally look for in a wing, but I think he more than makes up for it with his IQ and his toughness and the shooting, and he can pass. And anytime you have a wing that can dribble, shoot, and pass, and that's tough, I think that's always going to be appealing for NBA teams. All right, let's switch to Khaman Maluach. He's been a revelation for me. I've always thought he was a top 10 pick. I don't think I've had him any lower than number 7, but he's actually ahead of schedule from where I personally had him ranked. I thought he was going to be raw, but I thought he just needed to show some flashes to go in the top half of the lottery. One, he's impressed me with how well he responds to physicality. When I watched him at the Hoop Summit last year, Asa Newell just kind of picked him apart just because he was playing a little bit more chippier and a little bit more tougher and physical. But Maluach he hasn't looked out of place by any means. He's shooting 87% from the floor in the tournament. For me, he's went from one of the boomer bust prospects to a safe prospect. And I can't think of too many times where I've seen a guy enter the season where I thought high upside, but he could be Mo Bamba, or he could be one of these bigs that he gets drafted really high based off the flashes. But now I just think that he's safe because at the very minimum, he's going to provide rim protection. He's going to be a vertical lob threat, and he's going to be a guy that can anchor your defense.
I actually agree because Khaman Maluach's game against Alabama and throughout this tournament was as good as it can be because I've always had him in my top 10, like you said, and largely because I believe in upside. I believe in the opportunity to find yourself an all-star. You might as well take it. And, risk is there, but it's very unlikely that you're drafting in the top 10 and you have the luxury to make it a safe pick to really help your franchise more than taking a guy who could become an all-star, which is why I've always had him in the top 10 despite ups and downs throughout the season. But his game against Alabama was like teach tape for mobile centers. He was able to guard Mark Sears on the perimeter, and though he was beaten a couple times, he was able to recover and block shots. He was able to bang on the interior against Cliff Omarui, who's got the requisite size to make it difficult for Khaman Maluach. He was able to switch out and guard Aiden Sherrill after Nate Oates made a nice adjustment and said, you know what, because they're going to trail over here, let's hit the pop guy and Sherrill can shoot as opposed to Cliff. And Shire made a counter adjustment and said, Khaman Maluach, like, we're going to have you switch or we're going to have you, stunt back and get back and impact the game. And then offensively, he dunked the ball. He makes his shots. He's got good touch. His hands can improve, but you don't see a guy 7'2", as fluid as of a mover as he is. I think his coordination can still improve, and that is part of the upside. But if you asked me who I'd take at like number 8 between Maluach and Knueppel, I'd probably still lean Maluach because I think there's a higher ceiling, and I think he's far more safe than he looked before the season, like you said.
What do you think his draft range is? Do you think that he can go as high as – I saw somebody say that they think he can go as high as 4. But do you think he can go that high?
I was talking to one of my friends last night who's a diehard Duke fan, and we've talked about Duke basketball since we were very young. And he said there's a world in which he can convince himself that Maluach could go top 3, top 5, and somewhere between 3 to 5. And I said it's a little rich for where I see it. But if you were to tell me in a redraft they're ranking on upside, then I could believe it because his upside's very, very high, and he's having the safety allure that makes him more palatable to go that high. So I would say the highest I can see him go is probably the 5th pick, but it depends how the lottery shakes out. Maybe a team with a need in the front court it can believe in his potential and say, you know what, I think he could be the best prospect and he fits our roster build and our timeline. I could see it. I probably have him 7 myself, 7 or 8. But I wouldn't be mad at taking him at number 5, number 6.
I think that he's really helped himself. Like I said, it's crazy because he's helped. He's been better than I thought. The draft range is still about the same. The 3-point shooting, I think he made one in the tournament. The 3-point shooting was kind of like the swing skill in a sense. Like if he can show that he can knock down threes, then he could go as high as 4 in a sense. I don't think that's realistic, but like I said, for me, the biggest takeaway from his performance is I think that his floor, in my opinion, his floor is significantly better than what I thought it would be. And so with that being said, I think that he could end up one of the safer picks in this class. And I can kind of say that I think Flag is as safe as you can get. I think Knueppel is safe. May not be an all-star, but I could see him as this connective piece that contributes to winning because the way that he impacts the game in multiple ways. And with Khaman, he's literally gone from boomer bust, could strike out and be a guy that just kind of bounces around early, to a guy that I think is safe. I think he's going to be a starting caliber center on a good team, and you'll definitely take that, especially for a player that hasn't been playing as long as he's been playing, that is still somewhat raw. But I could just tip my hat off to him and how much he's improved over the year.
Yeah, and so here's the crazy part. I mean, you outlined it well, that it's boomer bust, and he has these inexplicable seeming, oh wow, why'd he drop that, or oh, he's not strong enough to box out said player throughout the year. This happened, and now in the biggest stage, he's playing very solid, steady basketball on a team that they're plenty talented enough to just say, yeah, we'll play Malik Brown, be safer. Like that, no, they're elevating what they already do with such a good base because of his unique traits and how dominant he is defensively, what he can do defensively and offensively as a vertical lob threat, someone who can provide vertical spacing, and his hands and coordination have gotten so much better, and they trust him far more on that end. And defensively, just the way that I saw him play Alabama and their very analytically derived offense, where it's, we're only shooting threes or layups, he took both away and made them do exactly what it's antithetical to what they believe in. And it was Khaman Maluach who was at the center of that. And it really made me believe in his draft stock, both in terms of the potential and the floor being higher. Like he raised his ceiling and his floor with that game alone.
Well, that wraps up this episode of the Locked On NBA Big Board Podcast. Once again, I apologize. You got the whole New York City experience in this episode. Sirens, train. I guess I didn't hear anybody yelling and fighting, but if I stay on a little bit longer, that might happen. Well, that wraps up this episode. Once again, thank you for making this your first listen of the day. Once again, it's Rafael and Leif Thulin, and we are out of here.